I'm David Knowles, and this is Ukraine, the latest. Today, we bring you the news from the battlefront as Russia continues to bombard Ukraine's border regions and cities. We report on the muted celebrations as Nato marks its 75th birthday, and we analyse a new, looming threat to Ukraine from Europe's resurgent right-wing political parties.
Bravery takes you through the most unimaginable hardships to finally reward you.
If we give President
with
Zelensky
victory.
the tools, the Ukrainians will finish the job. Slava Ukraini!
Nobody's going to break us. We're strong. We're Ukrainians.
Every weekday afternoon, we sit down with leading journalists from the Telegraph's London newsroom and our teams reporting on the ground to bring you the latest news and analysis on the war in Ukraine. It's Thursday, the 4th of April, 2 years and 40 days since the full-scale invasion began. And today I'm joined by our assistant comment editor Francis Dearnley and Brussels correspondent Joe Barnes. I started by summarising the latest updates from Ukraine. There's been another night of bombardments and strikes in eastern Ukraine. At least 5 people have been killed and 12 others injured in a Russian double-tap strike in Kharkiv. 3 rescue workers were among those killed when Russia struck a multi-storey building that had already been damaged in an earlier drone strike. This information is coming from the regional governor, Oles Nihubuhov. 6 people were wounded at that location, while another multi-storey building was hit by a drone, killing a 69-year-old woman. The remaining injuries were caused by missile strikes and shelling elsewhere in the war-torn region, with 15 Russian drone strikes reported in total. Each manifestation of Russian terror once again proves that the country terrorist deserves only one thing: a tribunal. That's from Ukraine's human rights chief, Dmytro Lubinets, publishing on Telegram in response to the attack. President Zelensky has also given his reaction. He said, "A strike on Kharkiv, just an ordinary apartment building with 3 shahids, a despicable and cynical attack. When the rescuers arrived at the scene of the strike, the terrorists attacked again. Russian terrorists will be held accountable for their actions in Kharkiv and for all acts of aggression against our people." Another tragic story that's emerged from this attack is a video circling on social media that shows a Ukrainian firefighter crying for his 52-year-old father and colleague who was killed in the strike. Staying in Kharkiv, the news continues to be bleak, with around 350,000 residents having been cut off from power supply in the city and the surrounding region after the overnight Russian drone attack. Ukraine's energy ministry said hourly blackout schedules were used in Kharkiv in the past days. About 100,000 subscribers were cut off. Last night's strike comes after Kharkiv's energy structure came under heavy bombardment amid a wave of Russian strikes on Ukraine's energy infrastructure that plunged parts of the city into a blackout. Elsewhere, staying on the same theme, in Zaporizhzhia, a high-voltage power line supplying the region's Russian-occupied nuclear power plant has gone down. The management of the plant say they're investigating, and there is no reported change in the radiation level. Moving north, Russian forces have attacked Sumy 46 times in 11 separate attacks over the past 24 hours, according to the regional military administration. Throughout yesterday, Russia pounded the border region with mortar, artillery, drone, grenade launcher and missile attacks, with the town of Velika Pisarivka experiencing the worst of the strikes, as 26 explosions were recorded in the area. The barrage comes after another Russian missile attack against the village of Krasnopilia killed 1 and injured 2 more, including a 3-year-old girl. Just to remind ourselves, Russia has stepped up its bombardment of Sumy in recent weeks, amid increasing reports of Moscow using destructive glide bombs, which of course we've talked about on the podcast, to target the region. A few more stories then before we go to Francis Dearnley. The Czech Republic will donate tens of millions of euros to an initiative it is leading to buy hundreds of thousands of artillery ammunition rounds for Ukraine. The Czech Prime Minister said that his country's contribution would be in the higher hundreds of millions of crowns, which equals low tens of millions of British pounds. Quote, "This roughly corresponds to the share that a country of our size and prosperity should put in," he said. The Czechs, through a team of government officials and private companies, have sought at least 800,000 large-caliber ammunition rounds from 18 countries around the world, with first deliveries to Ukraine expected by June. Germany has pledged the highest contribution so far, €576 million for 180,000 artillery rounds. Czech officials have said that the number is not final, and that there is more ammunition available globally if more funding can be secured. And just finally, there's been some further response in Russia to that big Ukrainian strike in Tatarstan that we've been talking about this week. This is Rustam Minikhanov, the head of Tatarstan, has urged local businesses not to rely solely on Russian air defence and instead take measures to, quote, defend themselves against potential drone attacks. He goes on, "Wake up, guys. No one will protect you except yourself." He told this to a meeting of energy industry leaders. More quotes, "No need to wait for missile defence to work, it solves other tasks." His comments, just to remind ourselves, come after Ukraine flew what is thought to be a light aircraft packed with explosives into a factory for assembling drones in Russia's central Tatarstan region. That's hundreds of miles from the country's shared border. That's all the military updates. Francis Dearnley, what are the latest developments in the political and diplomatic spheres?
Thanks, David. I ended yesterday's episode with speculation about the possibility of Congress flipping to Democrats mid-session, which has never happened before, but which commentators in the US are saying is plausible as Republican representatives seek to leave before November, or at least a few of them. The fact is, though, that Kyiv and its Western backers cannot rely on that. And even if they did, the timescale would be protracted, to say the least. Yet it's going to be protracted anyway. A US House vote on Ukraine aid isn't likely until at least mid-April and possibly later, multiple Republican officials have said in the past 24 hours. Speaker Mike Johnson previously said, listeners will recall, that a vote might be held right after Easter, but has been delayed further as Johnson searches for ways to assuage opposition from Republican hardliners. That's what the officials are reporting. Johnson's team hasn't shared any detailed plan on the aid package with Republican lawmakers and appears not to have settled on what concessions he would insist on from the Biden administration, despite all of those meetings with the White House and indeed the president, making it difficult for him, the officials say, to muster support in time for a vote next week. In a sign of just how far the right of the party has shifted in response to Donald Trump on this issue, Republican Congresswoman Victoria Spartz, who is on the TrumpP wing of the party and is the only US lawmaker born in Ukraine, someone I interviewed for the podcast back in September during our trip to DC, has said that she will not vote for the foreign aid bill. While Ms. Spartz, who immigrated to the US in 2000 from a small city in Chernihiv, did not say she opposes further aid, she emphasised that there is a lack of clarity from President Biden how the funds are being spent. She said, "I understand the importance of this battle and the implications if Russia is going to prevail, but I'm also not naive. If we don't have proper oversight, we are not going to achieve our goals," she told the Wall Street Journal. She also said that she supports the idea of Ukraine aid being delivered in the form of a loan, as suggested by House Republicans. Now, we'll put a link in the show notes to the interview I did with the Congresswoman, as she was certainly clear-eyed on Russia and the threat posed by its success. So my guess would be, and it is just a guess, that she is under considerable political pressure within the Republican fraternity to be sceptical and questioning of this bill, and indeed say that she would not support it unless there are major concessions. But I say that is just a hypothesis. And so, unfortunately, David, the saga of the delayed military aid package for Kyiv drags ever on. As I referenced yesterday, Frederick Kagan and other analysts at the Institute for the Study of War cite this as an example of Moscow's successful information operations targeting Washington. As we've discussed many times, the narrative one often hears, including from very informed figures in DC, is that the money will go from an American bank account into Ukraine's without much scrutiny. That is simply untrue. Most of the money, for a start, will be spent in the United States on funding weapons, building ammunition, etc. But it does seem that facts matter little when people have entrenched ideological positions that they masquerade as being rooted in fact. Unfortunately, I can't see that picture changing very much in the short term, but we just have to hope that the siren calls from Ukraine and others, and particularly America's Western partners, that the bill must pass soon, will provoke enough impetus within the Republican fraternity to have that vote. Because I think if they do have that vote and there is clarity on what concessions they need from the Democrats, then it will pass. I've not really heard anyone say they don't expect it to pass in some form, but it's just a question of timing and in what form that package does indeed pass. Now, in the European context next, as NATO marks its 75th anniversary, the British petition still seems to have one eye clear and open, and the other rather clouded perhaps even closed. Defence Secretary Grant Shapps has written for the Telegraph today a very strongly worded piece, for instance, arguing that NATO countries that don't spend 2% of GDP on defence are playing Russian roulette with the West's future. He reiterated the line that he said to Dom several weeks ago that allies must accept we are now in a pre-war world, and went on and said that it's not unreasonable for America to expect countries to pay their way. All fair enough. But then you have Lord Cameron, the British Foreign Secretary, whilst delivering a similar message on Wednesday during a trip to Brussels, and then indeed in DC is, I think, where he's next planning to go. And I think Joe was actually there at this speech in Brussels, so he'll cover it in more detail shortly, said unequivocally that there would be no chance of Western boots on the ground in Ukraine in any circumstances, in his view, which is, of course, something that Macron has suggested and which we've talked about many times in an attempt to, at the very least, be strategically ambiguous. And yet that doesn't seem to be something that Britain feels comfortable to do. So Cameron said, we don't want to give Putin a target like that. Fundamentally, this is a question of political will. He's right. It is. And he's probably right that there are many Western nations at present who are sceptical. But many will question, of the more hawkish persuasion, how helpful it is to vocalise this, especially given that some nations are not ruling out, given the threat of a major Russian advance, that they would put boots on the ground in extremis. The fact is, if the military situation does deteriorate, as is possible, then only red lines from Western nations might be able to stop a steamroller across Ukraine by the Russians. But I would argue that should be being articulated now, those red lines, not later, just as the urgency over weapons supplies should have been being prioritised 8 months ago or more, not just at the opening of 2024. But anyway, I digress. I referenced France there, and an interesting snippet out of Paris today that France's defence minister shared his first phone call in 22 months with his Russian counterpart to signal his country's willingness to increase communication to battle terrorism after the deadly Moscow attack last month. Whilst the pair also did discuss the war in Ukraine, with France reaffirming its support for Ukraine's fight, I think context is very important here. Their talk comes as France steps up preparations to host the Olympic Games later this year. That attack on the Moscow concert hall has revived security fears for the Paris Games, which begin on, I think it's July 26th. And so, whilst they say there's no specific terror threat, I think they are reaching out to all nations who are threatened by Islamic terrorism and trying to build bridges, even if it is Russia, in an attempt to ensure that all avenues of dialogue are open as they ramp up for what is, of course, a huge security challenge. So, as I say, I'm not sure, as some fear this morning, that this signals attempts by the Elysée to reopen lines of communication in order to encourage negotiation and communication. Rather, it's a very specific matter, terrorism, just as Western armies have a dialogue with Moscow to avoid accidental shoot-downs of aircraft. So I think a little bit of panic in some quarters, which perhaps is a little bit over-egging the pudding. Just lastly, David, Russia, meanwhile, is not very sporting when it comes to celebrating NATO's 75th birthday. Suffice to say, indeed, the Kremlin has reiterated that Russia and NATO are now in direct confrontation. To quote Peskov, its spokesman, NATO is already involved in the conflict surrounding Ukraine and continues to move towards our borders and expand its military infrastructure towards our borders. I think it's fair to say there'll be no birthday cake for him.
Well, thank you very much, Francis. Joe Barnes, you're in Brussels covering NATO's 75th birthday. Were any slices of cake for you?
Yeah, hi folks. So, yep, at the meeting of NATO foreign ministers to mark the 75th anniversary. And yes, Jens Stoltenberg and various foreign ministers did cut a cake today and to mark the moment. But yeah, what we're talking about is 75th anniversary of NATO is billed as the most successful defensive alliance in the world. But actually, if you take a step back, we're looking at doubts over that and its track record. Only have to look in the immediate. Is NATO doing enough to help Ukraine, especially when people are saying that if Ukraine falls or whatever, Putin will carry on. He will look at Eastern Europe. people are talking about living in a pre-war situation. Then you just have to look back at the mess left from the Afghan withdrawal recently. So there are quite clear doubts over whether NATO is fit to go on to reach its 100th birthday, for instance. And that was interestingly the theme and the essential theme of David Cameron's speech to the RUSI think tank at an event held at the British residence in Brussels yesterday. I was in attendance for what was literally a brief, a fleeting 10-minute or so speech. And he basically said that, look, NATO has lasted this long. He said it had been great. He said it had been formative in his youth. But now people need to make sure it appeals to the younger generations who didn't grow up with the Cold War lingering over them and the essentially living under the security umbrella that is NATO. So Lord Cameron, the Foreign Secretary, he raised concerns that younger people are not as pro-NATO as they were during the Cold War, as I said. And he said, we have to win the argument with NATO all over again with a new generation. And then he charted a path. Two paths. He said there is a route where NATO countries, NATO allies help Ukraine beat Russia. And that basically proves that NATO is on the right side of history. But then he read out a second idea of a second path where he said NATO allies allow Russia, Putin to win in Ukraine. And he said, look, there is another future for NATO, for the West. And that is one where we allow Putin to succeed. And the celebrations will be held mostly in Moscow and, of course, Beijing, Tehran and North Korea. That is a very bleak future, not only because I believe other European countries would be at risk, but I think all of the world would look around in America, Britain and other European powers when we stand up for our allies and ask how reliable we are, and even the absolute key to NATO, Article 5. So basically questioning whether NATO should exist and its role in the world. And he went on, allies in Europe would start looking at each other and wondering how much they could really trust each other. After that speech, we both, that's David Cameron and I, shot off to join a US celebration of the 75th anniversary at Truman Hall, which is the home of the US NATO ambassador, Julianne Smith. So all the great and the good of NATO and the foreign ministers were there. Jens Stoltenberg, General Cavoli, the Supreme Allied Commander Europe, and yeah, basically everyone. David Cameron was there. But what was, I think, some interesting to give you some colour of the event, the drink of choice was a gin fizz, I believe. The barman was telling me, but it was named a gin Ricky. I'm not 100% sure why. But what was interesting is they had devised a 12-course tasting menu, which was delivered around on shiny silver platters, inspired by a 1957 cookbook produced by NATO, named The Best of Taste. I've actually linked a copy on my Twitter page if anyone wants to go and actually read it in full, but I will give you some of the slight detail now. So the book was pulled together and produced by the wives of officers at the then HQ, the Supreme Allied Commander Atlantic, which is a former NATO command structure. And each leader of the 12 founding members of NATO had a submission. So President Eisenhower's submission, the former US president, was of an old-fashioned beef stew. It was omitted from the party's menu because they were slightly mocking of it, but I will give you a flavour and a taste of what President Eisenhower saw as a great meal. You stew beef until tender, add carrots, potatoes, onion, tomatoes, thyme, bay leaves, garlic, beef stock, and then leave to simmer for an hour and a half. Yeah, it sounds fantastically like an Irish stew. But then away from the festivities, there were more serious conversations going on because of what we've been reporting on as the prospect of a 100 billion aid package from NATO countries to Ukraine. France covered that in detail yesterday, so I won't go into too much. But what I can tell you is, in the discussions with foreign ministers yesterday, some of NATO's staunchest supporters of Ukraine cast doubt on the alliance providing Kyiv with 100 billion of military aid. So senior sources told the Telegraph that countries who have pledged to do whatever it takes to fuel Ukraine's war efforts were amongst those seeking to water down the fund. One of those countries is understood to be France, who, as we know, President Macron has basically said all options should be left on the table, including Western troops on the ground, and this idea of we should do everything we can to support Ukraine and the strategic ambiguity. So Jens Stoltenberg has basically proposed that NATO take over the US-led Ramstein, the Ukraine contact group, basically the group of about 50 or so international partners providing military support and coordinating military support to Ukraine. So Hungary's foreign minister had this to say: Hungary will reject any proposal that would transform it into an offensive alliance, as this would lead to the serious danger of escalation. This isn't Hungary's war, and it isn't NATO's war either. So But Hungary weren't alone in that. There were definitely concerns over what happens if we suddenly start shipping boxes stamped with the Nato compass into Ukraine. Does this make us more involved than we previously wanted to be? As we've said well before, NATO has not actually delivered lethal aid itself. Its NATO allies might have done, but they've done it bilaterally, not through NATO itself. The Spanish Foreign Minister, Jose Manuel Alvarez, said several, and I quote him, big countries had suggested the 100 billion fund would have to be recalculated to match, and I open quote, what Ukraine needs to keep its democracy, sovereignty, territorial integrity. And when we have this amount, we will decide how we can get it. So look, I don't think a deal was reached yesterday, it's safe to say, but they're going to keep working up until the NATO summit in Washington in July, basically to provide this package as a bridge to Ukrainian membership to NATO, because it's quite clear there is going to be no decision that says NATO should allow Ukraine in. And then I know you tried getting me on yesterday, but I was busy in a briefing, which is still embargoed, so I can maybe come on tomorrow or another day to talk through some of that. But you wanted me to talk about a story that James Crisp, your editor, Henry Samuel, our correspondent in Paris, and myself did on a new threat that is essentially facing Ukraine. So Ukraine, as we wrote, is facing a fresh existential threat this summer, but it's not from Russia, it's not from the US, it's from Europe. So a small but significant and highly vocal bloc of hard right, far right, nationalist, populist, what you want to call them, are basically on the march across the continent and are set to perform strongly in June's European elections. So they have scored positive results in Portugal, the Netherlands. They're already in government in places like Hungary, Finland, and Italy. They are hard right. The populists are sort of at the top of polls in Austria, Belgium, and could even win the European elections in France and Poland. And basically, many of these people think Europe should no longer be sending weapons to Ukraine. They also are calling for an end to sanctions on Russia and essentially looking at ways they think that they could bring peace. So looking down the sort of the list, so you look at Matthias Blazak, who is the chairman of Poland's Law and Justice Party, and he said, look, Donald Trump is known for his expressiveness and controversial statements, but that is his way of doing politics. As president, however, he has proven that he takes US commitments to both NATO and Europe seriously. But what we do know about Trump is he has suggested he would end the war in Ukraine one way or another, whether it be through negotiations with Putin or basically forcing Ukraine to the negotiating table. Why is this important? Because the EU has basically now outstripped the US on aid. And so I was speaking to Kira Rudik, the Ukrainian MP and leader of the liberal opposition Holos Party, and she said, look, this is one of the reasons why we should feel really worried. She said, like, Ukraine has to do more to basically tackle the narratives that are being put out by these parties. And I'll go through a few sort of quotes in a second. And she said there is a historical connection, whether it be legitimate or not, that basically she said, look, some of these far-right parties have got, there are historic accusations if they've received funding from the Kremlin, or at least been targeted directly by Moscow to undermine the narrative of a unified European position in support of Kyiv. So if you then look at some of the countries I mentioned, in Austria, Herbert Kickl, who's the leader of the far-right Freedom Party of Austria, he describes his model of managing Ukraine as the same one as Hungary. So we know Viktor Orban of Hungary doesn't donate weapons, doesn't really want to get involved in the war, and basically doesn't really want sanctions on. He hasn't blocked sanctions, he's probably helped to water them down, but EU sanctions are in place and he backs them, but he thinks they are basically nonsense. Then if you look at Belgium, where I'm from, I interviewed Tom van Dierik, who is the leader of Vlaams Belang, who are polling top of the Belgian national elections and for the European elections. He has previously said, look, Putin is not black or white, but 50 shades of grey. Not in hock with Putin, as some nationalist leaders. And he actually went as far as basically saying, look, some of his right-wing compatriots were wrong about the Russian leader, because there's lots of sort of right-wing figures who see Putin as a strongman leader, nationalistic, and as their kind of leader. He said, look, Putin is a real bastard invading another sovereign country. He really did something terrible. He's not a patriot. He's an imperialist. But, so the leader of Amsterdam went on to say he believes Belgium and other Western nations should halt arms shipments to Ukraine in order to end the bloodshed. He said basically the only thing that would stop the war is halt to the Western supply of weapons, because that would basically render Ukraine's fight it'd make it impossible. And that's something that's sort of shared in Germany. So Maximilian Krah was he spoke about the pro-transatlantic, anti-Russian approach with the riot, and it looks like how things will be done in Ukraine and like preparing for war with Taiwan. And basically said, look, it's not really our thing to be like getting involved in. So that is what we've been writing about, and I could take any questions, but I just think it's interesting to look at how a big election surge for the hard right, the nationalists, the patriots, as they like to call themselves, populists, whatever we want to call them, far right, could actually have repercussions on getting aid for Ukraine through. So, like in the Congress, it's blocked by a small group of Republicans. The bigger the right-wing, conservative, hard right, far right group becomes in Europe, will make it harder for the EU to do business in support of Ukraine. And I'll stop there.
Joe, that's fascinating. Thank you for talking us through some of the, parties and countries where, I think I hadn't really realised this was going on. What's the mood then in Brussels amongst Ukraine supporters? You mentioned in your interview with Kira Rudik that she was really, quote, really worried. What about the people who want to support Ukraine, who want to send things out? Do they appreciate the danger that their position is in, thanks to the rise of these and the progress of these parties?
Well, I think actually what you get is it's already taking effect. You have small tweaks to aid. You only have to look at Germany, and that's not like it has its sort of hard right, far right AfD group, but there are people who are traditionally being pro-Russian, or they are not as hawkish as some other European allies, and that's stopping tourists, for instance. It's stopping more serious weapons being sent. So that's the feeling is actually, yes, there is a problem, but it's immediate. There are people in Europe, whether it be, people even look at Britain and say, look, while Britain's done great things in sending Storm Shadows, it was first to send the main battle tank in the Challenger 2, but actually looking at going, is Rishi Sunak doing the right job? Looking at is he hiding too much behind the sort of the economic situation in Britain and sort of inflation and the sort of the domestic spending priorities? I think that's one thing that people are basically already moving back from going full tilt on their Ukrainian support, because they know that these threats exist and they're trying to solidify their voter bases or whatever. So it's a real interesting sort of thing. But yeah, I can say, like, I'm speaking to intelligence officials over the last week, sort of high level diplomats and stuff. Yeah, they are all acutely aware that without the US, Ukraine doesn't have enough weapons, but they're also critical of the European supply as well, and saying, look, we're probably not doing enough as it stands, and if we are doing enough, it's coming too slowly. That's to nod at the sort of French mindset of let's make sure we spend all EU-funded weapons for Ukraine on European projects rather than going outside the EU. So it's not a positive and joyous mood in Brussels for Ukraine at the moment. I'd say it's actually probably, apart from being actually in Ukraine and going to sort of military hospitals and seeing people who have been injured fighting, seeing families that are living in like the bomb-scarred apartment blocks from parts of the war and stuff, actually listening to the intelligence assessments and stuff that's becoming quite sobering now. And yeah, it really shows what's at stake, and maybe because of the right-wing challengers or domestic voter bases, it's actually becoming not as easy to support Ukraine as it once was.
And Joe, in your experience of European politics, how quickly could these changes be made? What happens? So these right-wing parties either do very well, they get quite a lot of representation, they might even win. Are they able to change the EU's policy on day one? Does it come at sort of certain meetings or groups or committee decisions? How quickly could the sort of supertanker of EU aid be turned around?
So everything in Brussels happens pretty slowly. To be frank, and that's one of sort of the criticisms, is the EU is not the most nimblest of ships It's an oil tanker compared to a speedboat, which I think I can attribute to von der Leyen about COVID jabs. But I think the moment we look at is early June. I think June 6th is the European elections for the European Parliament, MEPs. Basically from July onwards, when the new Parliament is minted, if there is a sort of a hard right, a far right, and nationalistic core who oppose support for Ukraine, that will become increasingly hard to get the legislation through, because basically the European Parliament, like the House of Lords, has sign off on EU law. So yeah, if there is a bigger contingent, a majority that don't support Ukraine in the way we currently do in the EU or in Britain, that then suddenly can become harder. It will make whether sanctions be harder to get through, because you have to space them off of talks with the Parliament and stuff like that, with new weapons packages, etc., and just more general support. Yeah, so it's a tricky situation. It could happen very quickly, but it would also have sort of repercussions over the next 5 years between the next elections.
And just finally, Joe, final question from me before we go to our final thoughts. This episode has felt especially bleak, with Francis giving the news from the US, you giving this news from the new threat from the rise of Europe's right-wing parties in the upcoming elections. Was there any good news that you've picked up over the past few days? Any sparks of light for our listeners that you could share?
Yeah, there's some interesting. Sorry, I didn't manage to listen to you guys yesterday, but there was some interesting news from Estonia. They've apparently found sort of 3 or 4 billion euros worth of available artillery shells on the open market, sort of mimicking the Czech scheme of producers and businesses going to find supplies on behalf of the government. That's good news. I was speaking to some Czech diplomats yesterday, and they were pretty confident they would still be able to find more supplies from where they've got their 1 million artillery shells mixed between 155 and the more Soviet standard 122s. Some good news. Like you look at like this idea, there is the NATO is talking about 100 billion. It's a big sum of money, and that it might get watered down. It probably will get watered down, but ultimately, it means NATO are going to be putting something on the table, which is hopefully extra money for Ukraine. So there are some positive sort of elements, but I would say it's particularly gloomy. It's a lot of patting each other on the back, saying how great NATO is, how great it's been over the 75 years. But actually, if you look at, I think the soul searching from David Cameron, from Grant Shapps, about purposing NATO moving forward is very important for us to look at. But yeah, it's tough, but there's always positivity. The Ukrainians are the best sort of to speak on this, because they're so resolute. They're the travelling journalistic pack of the Ukrainians are obviously very upset about what's going on, but they look for positivity. They're trying to basically they ask the tough questions, mostly of Western leaders. They're like their demand to know what's coming next, stuff like that, and those questions are still there. So the fight's not gone, and I don't think the fight's gone from European leaders. I just think they may be fighting with one hand tied behind their back at times.
Coming up, we hear Francis and Joe's final thoughts. Let's move then to our final thoughts. Francis Dearnley, would you like to go first?
Well, thanks, David. I'm happy to offer a little bit of optimism. I think inevitably we are at the moment, by the very nature of covering the war daily, looking at the micro picture, looking week by week, day by day, almost hour by hour sometimes. But if one zooms out, bear in mind, in the context of NATO has expanded this year. It is its biggest it has ever been, with the joining of Sweden and Finland. It has gained enormously from that in terms of adaptability, in terms of armed forces material, and just general troop numbers. It's also gained immensely from the intelligence that Finland and Sweden bring. And I don't just mean intelligence in a military context, I mean perspective on Russia, on the threat posed by Russia. And indeed, if Finland, Sweden, the Baltic states, Poland had been listened to earlier, then we might well have been able to prevent this terrible war. So I think we have a tendency to be too downbeat on the NATO context. I think NATO has rediscovered its sense of purpose as a consequence of this war. There is a renewed vitality at what is at stake. It has reached 75 years. It is the most successful defensive pact in history. It has never been triggered as it were, the Article 5. It was, of course, invoked following 9/11, but it has never been triggered in the way that it was designed in worst-case scenario. It has never been as large or as powerful as this at this very moment. And yet we talk in the way that Russia do quite often, which is that it's a waning power, that it's only a matter of time before it loses, as it were. At the end of the day, that is our choice. It's in our hands. And it's a crisis, if there is a crisis, of leadership. And all it will take, and I believe this on so many issues in the European and Western context, all it takes sometimes is somebody in the right place at the right time saying the right things, and everything can change. And there is just, if there is any hesitancy at the moment, it is people not following the next logical step based on what I think they know deep down, which is that this is an existential war, certainly for Ukraine, perhaps even for other countries. It may well be a war that escalates on a grander scheme if it is permitted to. And indeed, the real threat, if one is looking in the grander term, is posed by the ramifications of a Russian victory would mean for general global security in the context of China and everyone else. I think a lot of European and Western leaders know that deep down, but they are reluctant to follow the next step, which is going all in supporting Ukraine. And it may well be they'll get there, but I fear that things will have to get worse before they get better. But they will get better, David. I'm convinced of that. I think Russia has lost this war fundamentally in how it sought to win it. And I do not believe it would be able to control the entire country, even if it wanted to. So we just have to keep going on, just as the Ukrainians do. They are absolutely resolute, as Joe said. It was sobering being in Ukraine, but they are defiant, being no doubt about it. And I think that all it will take is some vocal leaders in Europe to step up and start articulating what is at stake. And it will rouse the sleeping dragon within the freedom-loving democracies of the Western world. It's just a matter of time.
Thank you very much, Francis Dearnley. Joe Barnes, would you like the very final words?
Really rousing stuff from Francis. I could only have D-reams, things can only get better, sort of playing in the back of my head. And I think if we hadn't have left the EU, particularly in 2016, you would be heading to the European Parliament as an MEP after that. But no, I want to touch on a little bit of good news as well from the battlefield, and a growing Western intelligence picture that is basically starting to show that Ukraine's deep strikes on Russian oil refineries are starting to have a positive effect. So in March, it has been found that Russian fuel imports from Belarus have leapt up significantly. Russia has imposed a 6-month export ban on fuel because they can no longer find enough for the domestic market and no longer basically need to bring in fuel to stabilize the prices at fluctuating. So Ukraine is believed to have impacted more than 15% of Russia's oil refinery capacity. And that's a number that has been floating around, but it has been now confirmed by sort of Western intelligence figures. And what this means is Russian officials are now having to export more crude oil, so at cheaper prices, to the likes of India, China, wherever they're going to sell it, that will then be refined there because they can no longer do it themselves. But what that does mean, quite interestingly, is, and it's not happening yet, but it will start having an effect on the supply of fuel to Russian forces in Ukraine. It might take weeks, it might take months, but the hope is that because of Western sanctions, it's going to be increasingly difficult for Russia to re-establish, to bring about and fix that 15% drop in capacity on its oil refineries because of the difficulty it takes to get components and parts and engineering mechanisms into the country because of those sanctions. So there is hope that as long as those strikes continue, that is actually going to start showing signs of impact on the battlefield, affecting that sort of supply chain of fuel to the front line. And that is good news. And I'll stop there. And yeah, thanks for listening, folks.
Ukraine the Latest is an original podcast from The Telegraph. To stay on top of all of our Ukraine news, analysis and dispatches from the ground, subscribe to The Telegraph. You can get your first 3 months for just £1 at www.telegraph.co.uk/Ukraine the Latest. Or sign up to Dispatches, our world affairs newsletter which brings stories from our award-winning foreign correspondents straight to your inbox. We also have a Ukraine live blog on our website, where you can follow updates as they come in throughout the day, including insights from regular contributors to this podcast. You can listen to this conversation live at 1 p.m. London time each weekday on Twitter Spaces. Follow The Telegraph on Twitter so you don't miss it. To our listeners on YouTube, please note that due to issues beyond our control, there is sometimes a delay between broadcast and upload. So if you want to hear Ukraine the latest as soon as it is released, do refer to the podcast apps. If you appreciated this podcast, please consider following Ukraine the latest on your preferred podcast app. And, if you have a moment, leave a review, as it helps others find the show. You can also get in touch directly to ask questions or give comments by emailing ukrainepod@telegraph.co.uk. We do read every message. And you can contact us directly on Twitter. You can find our Twitter handles in the description for this episode. As ever, we are especially interested to hear where you are listening from around the world. Ukraine the Latest was produced by Giles Gear, and the executive producers are David Knowles and Louisa Wells.